Cash up front, old man, or your car stays broken. The mechanic's voice, sharp as a razor, sliced through the humid air of the auto shop, echoing off the grease-stained walls. His words landed like a punch, and the small crowd of customers waiting in the cramped, oil-scented waiting area froze. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the scene unfolding at the counter. Tools clattered in the background, a radio blared a country tune, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingered from a pot left too long on the burner. 72-year-old James Jim Callahan, a Vietnam War veteran with a silver star pinned to his heart and a limp from a shrapnel wound, stood clutching his worn wallet. His hands, calloused from years of service and toil, trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sting of disrespect. Jim had just spent the morning at the local VA hospital, delivering handmade wooden toys to kids in the pediatric ward. His old pickup truck, a faded blue 1987 Chevy that had carried him through decades of memories, had sputtered to a halt on his way home. He'd limped it to this shop, Rusty's Auto Repair, hoping for a quick fix. Instead, he got a cold shoulder and a demand for prepayment, a policy the shop didn't enforce on the younger customers now staring at him. Jim's gray eyes, framed by deep lines etched from years of war and loss, met the mechanic's sneer. The man, barely 30, with a name tag reading Dylan and a smirk that screamed entitlement, leaned over the counter. "No credit for you types," Dylan added, his voice dripping with disdain. "You veterans always expect handouts." The words hung heavy, like the exhaust fumes wafting in from the garage. A woman in the waiting area gasped softly, her hand clutching her purse, but no one spoke up. The silence was deafening, broken only by the clank of a wrench dropping in the back. Jim's chest tightened, a familiar ache that wasn't just from his old wounds. He'd faced enemy fire, carried fallen brothers through jungles, and rebuilt his life after the war, only to be reduced to old man in his own hometown. He pulled out a faded photograph from his wallet, a Polaroid of him and his platoon, smiling under a Vietnamese sun, their dog tags glinting. It was his anchor, a reminder of who he was when the world tried to strip him down. He slid it back into his pocket, his jaw set. "I'm good for it," he said, his voice low but steady, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. "Just fix the damn truck," Dylan scoffed, tossing a rag over his shoulder. "Rules are rules. Pay or walk." He gestured toward the door, where the summer heat shimmered outside, distorting the view of the parking lot. Jim's leg ached at the thought of the 2-mile trek home, but it was the humiliation that burned deeper. He'd served his country, earned his scars, and now he was being treated like a deadbeat in front of strangers. A young man in a baseball cap snickered from the corner, whispering to his buddy, and Jim caught the word geezer. His fingers tightened around the wallet, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The shop's glass door swung open and a delivery driver dropped off a stack of parts, oblivious to the tension. Jim took a step back, his boots scuffing the cracked linoleum floor. He wanted to argue, to demand respect, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He thought of his late wife Clara, who'd always said, "You don't fight ignorance with fists, Jim. You fight it with dignity." But dignity felt like a luxury he couldn't afford right now. He turned toward the door, his limp more pronounced, each step a reminder of the war that never quite left him. As he reached for the handle, a low rumble vibrated through the ground, growing louder by the second. It wasn't thunder, too steady, too mechanical. Outside, the parking lot seemed to pulse with energy. The customers craned their necks, peering through the smudged windows. Jim paused, his hand still on the door, his heart thudding with a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. The rumble became a roar, and shadows moved across the asphalt. A convoy of motorcycles, their chrome gleaming under the midday sun, rolling into the lot like a storm cloud. We've only just begun this story, but trust me, it's about to get even more intense. Stick around to see what happens when Jim faces an even greater injustice. The roar of the motorcycles filled the air like a battle cry, shaking the windows of Rusty's Auto Repair. James Jim Callahan stood frozen at the shop's glass door, his hand still gripping the handle, his weathered face reflecting a mix of weariness and defiance. The parking lot outside was now a sea of chrome and leather. Dozens of bikers, their engines growling, had formed a semicircle around the shop, their shadows stretching long across the cracked asphalt. The heat of the Georgia summer pressed down, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and sun-baked pavement. Inside, the customers in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs rising like static. The mechanic, Dylan, stood behind the counter, his earlier smirk replaced by a flicker of unease as he glanced out the window. Jim's heart pounded, not from fear but from a spark of something he hadn't felt since the war, a sense of impending reckoning. He turned back to face Dylan, his gray eyes sharp despite the lines carved into his face. "You sure you want to play it this way, son?" he asked, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse than a smug mechanic. Dylan's jaw tightened, but he doubled down, tossing his rag onto the counter with a theatrical flourish. "I don't care who's out there," he snapped. "No money, no fix. Take your sob story somewhere else." The words stung, each one a jab at Jim's pride, but he stood taller, his limp barely noticeable now, as if the rumble outside had steadied him. The shop door burst open, and a towering figure stepped inside. A biker with a grizzled beard, leather vest adorned with patches, and eyes that burned with purpose. His boots thudded against the linoleum and the room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the radio in the background. "Heard you're giving our friend Jim a hard time," the biker said, his voice gravelly, like he'd swallowed half the desert. His name tag read Hank, and the patch on his vest declared him president of the Iron Veterans Motorcycle Club. The customers exchanged glances, some edging toward the walls, others pulling out their phones, the faint click of cameras breaking the tension. Dylan crossed his arms, trying to mask his nerves. "This ain't your business," he said, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Hank stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "Oh, it's our business," he said, pointing a gloved finger at Jim. "This man dragged my brother out of a burning chopper in Nam. Saved his life. You think you can treat him like trash?" The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. A woman in the waiting area gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while a teenage boy whispered, "No way," to his friend who was now filming the scene. Jim's throat tightened. He hadn't seen Hank in years, not since they'd shared a beer at a veterans reunion a decade ago. The memory of that jungle mission flashed through his mind. The heat, the smoke, the screams of the wounded. He'd carried Hank's brother Tommy 3 miles through enemy territory, his own leg torn by shrapnel. Jim's hand drifted to his pocket, where the faded Polaroid of his platoon rested. It was more than a photo. It was a tether to the man he'd been, the man he still was, even if the world sometimes forgot. Outside, the bikers revved their engines in unison, a deafening chorus that rattled the shop's windows. Dylan flinched, his bravado crumbling. "Look, I'm just following policy," he stammered, glancing at the manager's office door, which remained stubbornly closed. Jim stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with quiet fury. "Policy? You didn't ask that guy for prepayment," he said, nodding toward a younger customer who'd paid with a card earlier. "Or her," he added, pointing to a woman who'd breezed through without a second glance. "You saw my VA hat and my limp and decided I'm not worth your time." The accusation hung in the air, heavy as the humidity outside. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of discomfort and agreement. A gray-haired woman in the corner muttered, "That's not right," loud enough for others to hear. Another customer, a burly man in a flannel shirt, nodded, his face hardening. Dylan's eyes darted around, searching for an ally, but the room was turning against him. The tension was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Hank leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You got one chance to make this right, kid. Fix his truck, or we'll have a problem." Jim's chest ached, not just from the old wound, but from the weight of being seen, truly seen, for the first time that day. He wanted to tell Hank to stand down, to handle this his way, but the fire in his gut told him to let it play out. He'd spent too long swallowing disrespect, too long letting the world walk over him because of his age, his scars, his service. The bikers outside began chanting, "Fix it! Fix it!" their voices rising like a tidal wave. A young woman in the waiting area, tears in her eyes, shouted, "He's a hero, you jerk!" The crowd's energy shifted, a spark of collective outrage igniting. Dylan's face flushed red, his hands fumbling with a clipboard. "Fine, I'll talk to the manager," he muttered, retreating toward the office. But the door swung open before he could reach it, and a man in a cheap suit, presumably the manager, stepped out, his expression a mix of annoyance and confusion. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting from Jim to Hank to the growing crowd outside. Jim's fingers brushed the Polaroid again, grounding him. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. We're on the edge of the climax. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You can't miss how this story unfolds. The air inside Rusty's auto repair crackled with tension, the hum of fluorescent lights barely audible over the rhythmic roar of motorcycle engines outside. Jim Callahan stood tall, despite the ache in his leg, his gray eyes locked on the manager, a wiry man in a cheap suit whose name tag read, Gary. The shop's waiting area was a pressure cooker. Customers whispered, phones were raised to capture every moment, and the bikers' chant of, "Fix it! Fix it!" pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat. The smell of motor oil and burnt coffee mingled with the faint tang of sweat as the Georgia heat seeped through the glass door. Jim's hand rested in his pocket, fingers brushing the faded Polaroid of his platoon, a silent reminder of the battles he'd fought and the brothers he'd carried. This was another kind of war, and he wasn't backing down. Gary, the manager, stepped forward, his face a mix of irritation and calculation. "Everybody calm down," he barked, raising his hands as if he could silence the chaos. His eyes darted to Dylan, the mechanic who stood frozen behind the counter, clutching a clipboard like a shield. "What's the problem here?" Gary demanded, his voice sharp but unsteady. Hank, the grizzled biker president, didn't give Jim a chance to answer. He strode forward, his boots thudding like war drums. "The problem," Hank growled, "is your boy here disrespected a war hero. Demanded cash up front from Jim, but let others slide. You gonna fix this, or do we take it outside?" The crowd in the waiting area erupted in murmurs. A woman with a toddler on her hip shouted, "That's not fair." Her voice cut through the room, emboldening others. A man in a flannel shirt who'd been quiet until now stepped forward, his face red with anger. "I paid with a card, no questions asked. Why's this guy getting hassled?" The question hung heavy, and Jim felt a flicker of hope like a spark in the dark. He'd spent years swallowing slights, store clerks ignoring him, bureaucrats dismissing his claims, but this time the room was watching. The crowd was waking up. Gary's eyes widened, sensing the shift. He turned to Dylan, his voice low but venomous. "You singled him out?" Dylan stammered. "It's policy, I swear." But his words were drowned out by a sudden crash outside. A biker had kicked over a trash can, the metal clanging against the pavement. The crowd flinched, and a teenage girl gasped, her phone still recording. Jim's chest tightened, not with fear but with a flood of memories. Jungle ambushes. The weight of a wounded comrade, the promise he'd made to never leave a man behind. He pulled the Polaroid out, holding it like a talisman. "This," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to silence the room, "is why I don't beg. I earned my place here." He held up the photo, the faded image of his platoon under a Vietnamese sun, their dog tags glinting. "These men trusted me. I carried them through hell. All I'm asking for is a fair shake." His words landed like a grenade, and the room fell silent. Even Gary paused, his mouth half open. A woman in the corner, her eyes glistening, whispered, "He's right." The crowd's energy shifted, a tide turning. Someone clapped, slow at first, then faster, joined by others. The sound swelled, mingling with the bikers' chants outside. Before Gary could respond, the shop door flew open and a new figure stepped in. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a tailored blazer, her presence commanding. Her badge read, "Councilwoman Laura Hayes," and her eyes scanned the room with the precision of a general. Jim recognized her instantly. She was the daughter of his old platoon mate, Tommy, the man he'd saved in Nam. Laura's gaze locked onto Jim, and for a moment her stern expression softened. "Uncle Jim," she said, her voice carrying both warmth and authority. "Hank called me. What's going on?" The room held its breath. Hank stepped back, giving Laura the floor. Jim's throat tightened. Not from shame, but from the weight of being seen, truly seen by someone who knew his story. He recounted the ordeal, the demand for prepayment, the sneers, the policy that seemed to apply only to him. Laura listened, her jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, she turned to Gary, her voice cutting like a blade. "You're telling me a Silver Star veteran can't get his truck fixed without being humiliated?" "In my district," Gary's face paled. "It's a misunderstanding," he stammered, but Laura wasn't having it. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the linoleum. "No, it's discrimination, and it ends now." She turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "This man served our country. He deserves better than this." The crowd erupted in cheers, phones flashing as they recorded. A young man in a baseball cap who'd snickered earlier now looked down, his face flushed with shame. Dylan slumped behind the counter, his bravado gone. Laura turned back to Gary. "Fix his truck, no charge. And post a sign. Veterans get priority here. No questions asked." She pointed to the door where a biker was already holding a makeshift sign reading, "Honor our vets." Gary nodded, defeated, and muttered to Dylan, "Get on it. Now!" The crowd cheered again, and Jim felt a warmth spread through him, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Laura walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't fight alone, Uncle Jim," she said, her voice soft but fierce. She handed him a small pin, a replica of his Silver Star, to replace the one he'd lost years ago. He pinned it to his jacket, his hand steady now. As the bikers revved their engines in triumph, Jim looked at the crowd, their faces a mix of awe and respect. He thought of Clara, his late wife, who'd always said dignity was his greatest weapon. Today it had won. He stepped outside, the Polaroid back in his pocket, and shook Laura's hand, the pin gleaming on his chest. The bikers parted, forming a path to his truck, now being worked on by a chastened Dylan. The crowd followed, chanting, "Hero! Hero!" a sound that echoed like the cheers of his platoon long ago. Jim walked away with his head high, the weight of the day lifting. The shop would never forget this moment, and neither would he. Sometimes justice wasn't just a word, it was a convoy, a community, a reckoning.